Why are there so many stories today of Christians deconstructing their faith? Is there a difference between deconstruction and deconversion? Should Christians doubt their faith? Well, these have been huge questions people have been talking about for a number of months, but it's also kind of bubbled to the surface recently and been a huge topic of conversation. My guest today, Dr Mcclatchy, is one of the smartest people that I know. He's an assistant professor, a writer, a debater, and a fellow at Discovery Institute, and has thought about this a lot, and it has a new ministry we're going to talk about. You can see it on his hat, not so subtle advertising. Talkaboutdoubts.com. We'll get into that, but first off, Jonathan, thanks for taking the time to join me.
Sean, thanks so much for having me on. It's an honor.
Yeah, you betcha. Well, let's just jump right in because there's a lot to cover on this topic, and I'm curious why you think we're seeing so many deconstruction stories today.
Yeah, it's not clear whether more people are deconverting at the moment or whether people are just feeling more open about sharing it publicly.
Mm.
Certainly, there's a lot of people sharing publicly their deconversion stories on YouTube and other platforms. It may be due in part to the quarantine that all of us have been subjected to over the last couple of years with COVID-19, and I think with such a wealth of information on the internet, people are searching and going online and finding all sorts of voices that are willing to share their perspectives with them. And I think it's contributed to people thinking about these things in a more critical way.
That's really fair. I think we could almost add to that point when it comes to social media and just the culture we live in. We're told live your truth, proclaim your story, announce who you are to the world. In the past, probably if people deconstructed or had doubts or left their faith, there wasn't the need or the pressure or the means to tell the whole world unless you're going to write a book about it. And it still probably had minimum attention to it. But today on social media, you can't just hide. You've got to plug something. So my question is like, are there really more stories happening, like you said, or is it just drawing our attention more to this? Because to be honest with you, there's some, other famous evangelist kids who've left their faith and they get a ton of press. But nobody does a story like, hey, apologist follows his father's footsteps. So I always wonder the point that you're making. But let's ask this question. Do you think this phenomena of deconstruction is new?
Absolutely not. I mean, there's stories of deconstruction going back long time to the dawn of Christianity and the early church. There's one excellent book called Crisis of Doubt, which is about stories of deconstruction and then subsequent reconstruction during 19th century England. And it's a really fascinating read. The author basically complains that how many books are out there on stories of deconstruction or deconversion in the 19th century. And he wanted to rectify that by talking about stories of reconstruction, where people had done an honest investigation into the evidence for Christianity, and having previously lost their faith, perhaps through reading David Strauss or someone like that, they found that actually Christianity is well supported by the evidence after all, and ended up coming back to faith.
That is so fascinating. I'd never heard of that book before. That it's this phenomenon, at least I think you said the 19th century, but even in the church itself, in the scriptures itself, there's commandments. Stay strong in the faith. Don't leave the faith. There's a sense that people could even leave, at the time the New Testament documents were written. Do you think this phenomenon is going to go away? Do you think it's going to get bigger, stay the same? Like, if you had to guess, where do you think the phenomena of deconstruction is going?
Well, it's absolutely not going to go away. And if anything, I think it's going to get bigger. And I think that now what we're seeing is only the beginning of this tsunami of people falling away from the faith.
Wow.
And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is that as the church, we really haven't done a very good job of equipping people with the intellectual tools that they need to really think critically about the onslaught of information that people get online. And we haven't done a very good job of informing people about the positive case for Christianity. And so if you go on YouTube and search something like street epistemology, or you watch the atheist experience, and you find Christians that are so ill-equipped, and even the basics of why do you believe Jesus as opposed to Muhammad or some other religion, and they don't even know, the basics of how to defend the faith. And so that is a perfect recipe for people when they encounter a Bar Ehrman, for example, online. Uh, it's going to completely rock their faith and result in them deconverting rather than critically examining those and indeed contextualizing it within the positive case for Christianity.
Those of you just joining us, we're here with Dr. Jonathan McClatchy talking about deconversion, deconstruction, how the church can and should respond. Do you have a sense, and this might be a speculative question, but do you have a sense of how many people that are leaving were just in the church but never truly followed Jesus versus those who are really in the faith and left? Like, I get asked that sometimes, and it's a complicated question because I always want to believe somebody, their story, and their experience. But many times when somebody's left and we have theological questions, I realize, gosh, in many cases, I'm not sure this person ever really understood or experienced the gospel firsthand. What's your take?
That's a really good question, and I think that it's complicated. There's people. There's the deconversion community is very, very diverse. If you talk to one deconvert, you've talked to one deconvert, right? Um, I um, I think that one of the worst things that you can say to someone that is deconstructing their faith or has deconverted from the Christian faith is you weren't really a Christian, because that's very offensive to people, especially people that grew up their lives in the church and really invested a lot in Christianity and then subsequently lost their faith. Now, of course, there's difference of thought within Christianity about whether someone can lose their salvation or whether if they do walk away, whether they actually had a relationship with Christ to begin with. But be that as it may, even from a kind of a more Calvinistic perspective, where someone cannot lose their salvation, and if they apostatize, that's evidence of them not having been in the faith. I would still distinguish between what you might call a soteriological sense Christian and a propositional assent sense Christian.
Okay.
And so I think that someone can be a Christian in the sense that they propositionally assent to the truth of Christianity, even irrespective of whether they have a genuine relationship with God and so forth. And of course, if you're an atheist, then you don't think anyone has a relationship with God in the first place anyway.
That's fair enough. Hey, just for those of you watching, we're going to take some questions as we get towards the end. So write your question down or repeat it in caps, write question. And for Dr. McClatchy, for myself, we'll do our best to tackle those. But let's clarify some terms. I get the impression when we're talking about deconstruction, sometimes people are talking past one another. And I've totally been guilty of this myself, using the term maybe in an equivocal fashion. So let's start with this distinction. Do you make a distinction between deconstruction and deconversion?
Yeah, so deconstruction is a very popular term in common parlance, at least in recent couple of years. I think that deconstruction has a more classical usage, of course, which is essentially the words don't have objective meaning. It's kind of a postmodernist term. But the term deconstruction has become, as you know, co-opted in the community of people that are leaving Christianity. And basically what it means in the sense in which that community is using it is, taking apart the faith, critically examining long-held beliefs and traditions and so forth, and that can of course lead to deconversion, but it doesn't necessarily have to lead to deconversion. In fact, it can lead, at least in principle, to a more enriched faith, as one comes to terms with the objections to Christianity and the evidence for it. In fact, when I have kids, one of the things I want to do is to make sure that they understand all of the best objections to Christianity, that they hear them from me before they hear them from anyone else. Because I think that when you and I often work through atheist books like about Ehrman or other atheist authors with people that are struggling with faith, because I think that reading those books and thinking through them critically can help you to enrich your faith as you see how strong the evidence is and how weak the objections actually are when you think about them critically.
I would make that distinction too, the deconstruction, and then we're going to get into 4 different ways that the word deconstruction is used. But as a whole, there's a difference between questioning your faith, having a crisis of faith, but hanging on to orthodoxy, and abandoning orthodoxy, whether you become some aberrant version of Christianity or Gnosticism or atheism. So I think that's a helpful distinction to make. Deconstruction hangs on to the core faith, deconversion leaves the core faith. As far as it goes, that's helpful. Now, there was an article in Desiring God by John Boom I thought was really helpful when he made 4 distinctions about how the term deconstruction is often used. And I'll just cite these so our audience and we're all on the same page. One is he said, shedding unbiblical views adopted from culture. So it's a process of just getting rid of and shedding negatively certain views somebody held and associated with their faith, sheds them away. That's step number 1, or deconstruction kind number 1. Number 2 would be certain historic Christian doctrines are abandoned. And I would say this might be in the case of not all, but in some progressive Christians who question things like the resurrection or the deity of Christ, some of those core doctrines. Still identify as Christian, but abandon some of the core doctrines. Third would be departure from Christianity entirely. Become a Buddhist, become an agnostic, become an atheist. That one's easy. And fourth, he says, is a kind of faith crisis, where somebody goes through an emotional questioning period, but holds on to their faith. So for me, I would say, and these are not necessarily in the best order, I would say 1 and 4, shedding unbiblical views, going through a faith crisis, I would be comfortable using the term deconstruction insofar as it goes, if that's what we mean by it. Now, your thought when we give those different definitions of deconstruction?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Yeah, I would agree with that way of parsing it out.
That was the simplest, quickest answer. Would you add any other ways, John? Are there other ways that you can think of that deconstruction is used, or any of those you wouldn't apply? Or if not, that's fine. Just want to make sure we're nuancing this in a way that we make a distinction between shedding faulty beliefs, having a faith crisis, and abandoning core doctrine and the faith entirely.
Yeah, yeah, I think that I don't really have much to add there. I think
Okay.
deconstruction is a healthy process in the sense that we might all of us have false beliefs, right? It's just we're not always aware of what our false beliefs are. If we were aware of what our false beliefs were, we'd change them. And so deconstruction is a healthy thing in that sense. But unfortunately, um, uh, there's an undisciplined way of going about deconstruction, and there's a disciplined way of going about it. Unfortunately, a lot of the people I've interacted with who are struggling with doubts, they engage with their doubts in an undisciplined way, where they essentially send the plane into a nosedive and panic
Yeah.
rather than actually taking the time to sit down and like when you're reading an atheist book on, say, the New Testament or the Old Testament or whatever, one of the key pieces of advice I would give is always make sure you check the primary sources for yourself. I, for example, when I study Bart Ehrman with people who are struggling with doubts, I would encourage people to look up the sources he cites for yourself, look up the Bible references he quotes, because he often, unfortunately, misrepresents his sources. And if you don't look up the primary sources for yourself, you're never going to realize that. And so that's, I think, the key difference between disciplined deconstruction versus undisciplined.
Okay, so we're going to get into how Christians should face doubts process wise. A couple of the questions, just in terms of the terminology that's used, is would you say deconstruction is synonymous with spiritual growth or sanctification? Because there's some people who have raised concerns of people saying you should deconstruct their faith, and some have pushed back and said, no, it has a negative terminology. What you mean by is we should just grow spiritually and sanctify, but would caution using the term that you should deconstruct your faith.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by the term. Again, if I think that you should critically examine your faith. So when I talk to people who are doubting their faith, I often say that I think it's a good thing that people are questioning their faith. I wish more people would question their faith and think about it critically, because that's a path to a more enriched faith and intellectually robust faith.
Okay.
So I encourage people to question their faith in that sense, right? as long as it's done in a disciplined way.
Okay, good. Well, we're gonna get into some of that now. The term deconstruction clearly has roots, at least etymologically speaking, with postmodernism and some of the thoughts of Derrida. So, is there a connection, as far as you know, between how the term deconstruction is used for a questioning of one's faith and potentially abandoning it, and deconstruction that's a part of the postmodern movement?
Did you ask what's the relationship between those?
Yeah, are you aware that there's a connection between deconstructing one's faith and deconstructionism, as is coined by Derrida?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of there being a relationship or a connection between them. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, see, that's a good question. I think there has to be. I'm not sure that people who use the term deconstruction of their faith have probably read Derrida. I mean, I tried to
Mhm.
read Derrida anyways, and it's kind of painful and actually intentionally not clear because he's deconstructing one's worldview through the process of not following normal literary standards. So it's kind of an experience somebody has. So I don't know that most people who use deconstruction have taken the time to really read postmodern thought and what deconstructionism is. I've heard some people make that connection, and I just don't know. So if you're not aware, we can keep moving on. But it at least minimally makes me suspicious to a degree of whether Christians should use the term deconstruction since it has that baggage. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. And there's other people that have commented to the same effect that deconstruction is perhaps not the best term to use. There's a perfectly good traditional term, which is deconversion, for leaving the faith or experiencing doubts when you're questioning your faith. Deconstruction is used in that sense as a more modern term, and because of its baggage, as you put it, I would be, I think that caution about using the term in that sense is probably warranted.
That's fair. I think we're going to use it. We're going to have to define our terms carefully and just make sure we nuance for our audience what we mean by deconstruction. So, not use it without at least that qualification. That's understandable. Let's shift then. Given that we have this phenomenon of people deconstructing their faith, whether that results in deconversion or not, we're hearing prominent stories of musicians and former pastors and apologists who've deconstructed their faith and deconverted. Tell us about how you approach this. So let's just start. Tell me about talkaboutdoubts.com. Was this motivated in part to address some of this deconstruction phenomena?
Yeah, so I have been doing this ministry privately on my personal website since 2016.
Mm,
And I've usually, when I did it on my personal website, I would get on average maybe one or two requests per week, which, I was able to fit into my schedule just fine. And I'd reach out to the inquirer, set up a one-on-one Zoom call, and we talk about there are questions of concern and so forth. And then more recently, I had the idea to develop this into a ministry involving other people as well. So I started to build a team of other scholars and experts in various fields who were interested in having one-on-one calls with Christians who are wrestling with intellectual doubts concerning the veracity of the Christian faith. We've assembled a team now of more than 40 scholars and experts in different disciplines. We have New Testament scholars, we have philosophers, we have scientists, we have a couple of Old Testament scholars.
mm,
So we have theologians as well, and psychologists. And we basically, the way it works is we have an inquiry that will come into the website submitted through the forum at talkaboutdoubts.com. And then we distribute that to a relevant scholar who is qualified to address that particular concern. And then that scholar will get in touch with the inquirer directly instead of a one-on-one Zoom call to talk about their doubts with them in confidence. And um, we've been getting on average probably about 10 to 15 requests per week with talkaboutdoubts.com. And yeah, and we get a whole range of different topics. We get science questions and Bible questions, and people struggling with emotional doubts, and so forth. In terms of how I approach Christians who wrestle with doubts about their faith, I would try to help them to develop protocol for working through doubts in an intellectually responsible way. As I said before, I think it's important to approach this in a disciplined way rather than undisciplined way. So I'd first of all encourage people to prioritize high stake objections over low stake objections. So a
Okay.
high stake objection to Christianity would be um, a challenge to, say, the resurrection of Jesus, or a challenge to whether Jesus even existed, or a challenge um, to the historicity of Moses and the Exodus, or something like that. That would be what I'd consider to be a high stakes objection. And then there are also low stake objections, such as, for instance, an objection to young Earth creationism, for example, for a young Earth creationist. Well, I would argue that there are very plausible hermeneutical approaches to the early chapters of Genesis, which are consistent with an old Earth perspective. And so, in my view, the evidence for Christianity is such that it is rational. It is more rational to revise one's theological view and become an old Earth creationist rather than abandoning Christianity. And so that's what I consider to be a low stakes objection, or an objection to eternal conscious torment, regardless of where people sit on that particular debate. I think that there are sufficiently plausible arguments from Scripture. I mean, John Stott, for example, probably the best known theologian who would defend that view. Um, and so the arguments, in my view, are sufficiently plausible, and that it's more rational to adopt an annihilationist perspective rather than abandoning Christianity in toto, and so forth. And so that these would be examples of low stake objections. And so a lot of people I talk to get so fixated on just the sheer number of low stake objections that they lose sight of the forest for the trees and miss the avalanche of positive confirmatory evidence. And so I encourage people to prioritize the high stake objections and try to focus on one issue at a time, rather than switch going from one thing to the
Yeah.
other and getting obsessive about all of the different topics that you could explore.
So a lot of what you're doing is trying to help people reframe certain objections and maybe look at it in a way they hadn't before. When I get objections like, say, contradictions in the Bible, that's important, but I would consider it a lower stake objection, of course, than the resurrection. We could still know if Jesus rose from the grave if there were contradictions in the Bible. We'd have to rethink what inspiration means and obviously what inerrancy means and those doctrines, but I don't think it would take Christianity down with it. Finding the body of Jesus would. So I found
Right.
the same way when there's doubts, to try and help people say, I'll kind of draw concentric circles. Is this in the center at the heart of the faith? Is it secondary? Is it tertiary? And framing it that way I found helpful to people. Here's
Right. I completely agree. And I would also like to distinguish between I don't think that all discrepancies or alleged errors in the Bible are epistemically equivalent, meaning that they all carry the same weight. So, for instance, I distinguish between a good faith mistake versus a deliberate distortion of fact. If you discover that there are examples of, say, the gospel authors deliberately inventing whole pericopes, whole narratives, whole dialogues, then that's much more concerning than if they forgot exactly which day of the week that it happened. And so that's an important distinction, I think, to make as well.
very helpful. In light of your experience, here's a great question. I'm just going to jump to earlier than normal, but Ethan asks a wonderful question. And let me bring it over here. Ethan Schill, sorry if I mispronounced that. He says, how do you suggest I minister to a friend who's experiencing doubts of their own?
Yeah, so I would encourage you to set up a meeting with that person where you sit down and have a conversation about it in a deliberate way rather than kind of an ad hoc way, where you sit down and talk about the questions and concerns that that person has. Ask them to send you, say, a paragraph summarizing what their key concerns are, and then do your homework, do your research in advance of that conversation with them, and talk to them about what their concerns are, and also help them to develop protocols for thinking through doubts on their own intellectually responsible way, as I said. I think it's also important, by the way, to encourage people to distinguish between questions and objections, because not all questions are objections, right? A question can express an objection, but a question only becomes an objection when it has an additional premise, right? Either the extra premise would have to be either that we we don't know the answer, and if Christianity were true, we should expect to, or we do know the answer, and that entails some sort of internal incoherence or is at odds with empirical evidence. Short of that extra premise, it only remains a question rather than an objection. So, for instance, one question I sometimes get asked at talkaboutdoubts.com is, what happens to those that have never heard the gospel? What about the Amazonian tribesman who's never had access to the gospel? And one of the things I'll say there is, okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that we don't know what God's arrangements are for such people. Okay, that's just a question we don't know the answer to. But we can nonetheless trust that God is good and that God is just, because we have justification for believing that to be so. And so we can trust that God has some just and good arrangement for such individuals who've never had the opportunity to hear the gospel, even if we don't know what that arrangement is. So that's
Mm.
what I would consider to be more of a question than an objection. And we all have questions, and it's
Yeah.
fine to have questions, and it's even fine, by the way, to have unanswered objections that we don't currently have answers to, because the question is not so much, are there unanswered objections to the Christian faith? Rather, the question ought to be, are there more numerous and more substantive objections to believing the gospel or to not believing the gospel? And in my view, there are far more numerous and far more substantive objections to disbelieving the gospel than there are to believing it. And this actually gives rise to what the Christian philosopher Richard Whately, who lived in the 17 and 1800s, called the fallacy of objections, which is where you become so fixated on objections you don't know the answers to that you miss sight of the many more powerful and more numerous objections to the contrary position.
Mm. That's a great response. The one thing that I would say to encourage your friend Ethan is spend a lot of time just listening and try to get to the heart of the issue, because people can doubt for a range of different reasons. As Gary Habermas has written, I know you've read a lot of this, Jonathan, as Gary Habermas has written books that so much of doubt is emotional. Disappointment with God, pain, bad experience, hurt. Some doubt is moral. People don't want to believe in God. And I've had people tell me that to my face. Some is volitional and some is intellectual. And sometimes it's multiple combinations of those. So there's a proverb, I think it's 20, verse 5, that says, the purposes in a man's heart are deep, and a man of wisdom draws it out. I want to try to use wisdom just by listening and understanding what's the heart of the doubt for this person, and then trying to dress it accordingly as best I can. So we're going to get into some of that now, Jonathan. How you've probably done dozens and dozens of these. How many times do you find in doubt there is some kind of hurt or pain as a part of it, or sometimes driving it? For those of you watching, I'm not downplaying legitimate questions or saying it can all be summed up in this fashion. But in my experience, Jonathan, so often there is hurt and pain that when I hear that person, I think, gosh, I don't know that I'd want to be a part of the church either. How common is that just in your experience?
Yeah, it is common. It's not everyone's case for sure. As I said before, if you talk to one deconvert or one person struggling with doubt, you talk to
Right.
only one such person. It's a very diverse community. So some people, as you said, is volitional and moral, but I think that we have to be nuanced and say explicitly that it's not everyone that for whom it's volitional and moral. Some people, there are people who are sincerely persuaded that Christianity cannot be sufficiently justified. Now, I disagree with them in that assessment, but such people do exist. Some people, yeah, they've been hurt by the church, and that is a part of their doubt. And um, I think that you need to, as you said, Sean, give them a listening ear and talk to them and try to empathize with them in their circumstances. From a rational point of view, you can also point out that Christianity, if true, actually predicts that you'll find people who are hypocritical and people who are professing to be followers of Christ who are actually not. And so the fact that you find hypocrites, in fact, cannot be taken as a severe blow against Christianity when Christianity, in fact, predicts that very thing. So,
Yeah.
yeah, does that
That's
answer your
true.
question?
Yeah, that's true intellectually, but it's hard emotionally, isn't it? When someone's going through
Right.
that relationally, that's the difficulty to separate. All right, here's a question from Pine Creek. Pine Creek, thanks for watching. He asked an interesting question. It's directed to me. I'll let you jump in. I'll give my 2 cents. He says, if someone has sincere doubts on high stakes issues in Christianity, why is it so bad to just leave Christianity? What do you think, Dr. McClatchy?
um, Well, it depends what the doubts are, and whether so it's a question of whether the reasons for leaving Christianity are in fact rational, or whether they're based on correct information or not.
Mm.
So um, if I was sincerely persuaded that the evidence uh, disconfirmed Christianity, then sure, I would deconvert. If I thought that theism was disconfirmed by the evidence, I would become an atheist.
Mm.
But so there's nothing epistemically non-virtuous about deconverting if in fact the evidence justifies that. I would just contest whether the evidence actually justifies that. In fact, I think that the evidence justifies a Christian belief, and that's why I do this ministry, is to try and convince people that actually the evidence justifies Christianity rather than its falsehood.
That's a great response. If Christianity weren't true, then somebody should deconvert, and we would be hindering them by stopping them and having this ministry if it's not true. The heart of the question is what is true. And so, of course, you and I have thought about this a lot. And although we have questions, and I certainly have doubts at time, since I think Christianity is true, feel an obligation to help others hopefully see that it's true as well. By the way, if this is helpful, give us a thumbs up. It helps with the metrics. We want to draw attention to Jonathan's ministry, talkaboutdoubts.com. I think it's one of the most important ministries in the church in some time. Here's a really interesting question, Jonathan. I want to get your thoughts on this one. Priya, who watches now and then, nice to see you again. She says, how do you encourage a friend who is deconstructing because of political views of their church?
That is something I've never encountered. Someone leaving the Christian faith because of the political views of their church.
Hmm.
Um, I can imagine someone leaving their church and going to a different church because of political views, but that's certainly a new one. So I'd be interested to hear more of the particulars on that particular case.
So that's fair. I could guess that there might be some people who would say, hey, my church is promoting Trump, for example, and I think he's immoral, and I just can't believe I'm so burned by this. I'm leaving. I can't be a part of this faith anymore. I've heard that. I don't know how common it is, but I certainly heard that. What I would do, and then you can jump in here, I would just try to, whether it's Trump or Biden or whoever, whatever the political position is secondary to me. I would try to talk that person through and say, okay, if your church is too committed to a particular political view, is this what Jesus taught? Is this what the Christian faith is? So, is the problem with the people in the church who are infallibly living this out and too much tying their political views and their theology views, or is the problem with the faith itself? I would just try to disentangle for that person and get to the heart of the issue, because when it's all said and done, if a church is too imbibed in one political view or the other, it has nothing to do with whether it's true or false. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. If I mean, Jesus didn't endorse Donald Trump, for example. Jesus didn't endorse Joe Biden either. So I think that it really comes down to whether Jesus actually would endorse or affirm the political views that are causing you concern, and then you would want to determine, okay, why, if Jesus did endorse something that you disagree with, such as for instance his stance on sexuality, then you might want to ask, okay, why did Jesus affirm that, and is that defensible?
Fair enough. There's some great questions coming in, by the way. Let's just keep pulling from questions. If you do have a question for myself or Dr. McClatchy, just put question in caps so I can see it in the comments. The rest of you throw a comment in there. It just helps us, anyways. Here's a very thoughtful question from Brian Purcell. He says, how do you deal with doubt if your church denomination says that if you don't believe this, then you aren't one of us? That can be a painful break. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think that unfortunately a lot of churches have a tendency to uh, have a my way or the highway type of approach to theology, where you have to where they make the amount of the number of things that you have to assent to in order to
Mm.
be a Christian very, very high. So, for instance, there are um, churches that are very big on young earth creationism, or King James onlyism, or um, and other ideas which are, or Calvinism, or other ideas which are, which shouldn't really be points of division between Christians. So there are first tier issues, and there are secondary tier issues, and there are third tier issues. The first tier issues do differentiate a Christian from a non-Christian, and these would be things like the resurrection, um, the uh, um, the deity of Christ, the Trinity, that kind of thing. And then there are secondary tier issues which don't differentiate a Christian from a non-Christian, but do differentiate which church you might go to versus another. So, for instance, views on baptism, adult baptism versus child baptism, for example. And that's, again, it's an important issue, but it doesn't determine your salvation. And then there are third tier issues, which really ought to be in-house discussions even among Christians of the same church. And examples of that would be whether you're a Calvinist or an Arminian, or whether you believe in eternal conscious torment or conditionalism, or and so forth. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great distinction. I would recognize, yeah, anytime you break with any community, it can be painful. So whenever I hear this, whether the issue is justified or not, my heart goes out because relationships are broken. But I think the key is to ask, is this an issue that a church should divide over or not? Yeah, if someone questions the resurrection, should divide. I would say the issue of pro life, when you're dealing with the most vulnerable amongst us, is that issue. I would hold that issue with marriage. I think it's a Catholic lowercase c issue. Scripture's clear on from beginning to the end, and historically speaking. If a church embraces racist ideas, you should break from that. So, really, we see precedent in the scripture that churches should say you have to believe certain things. And so we can make one mistake adding stuff to that shouldn't be added in. That becomes legalistic. Or we can take away certain things that you should believe. That can become libertine. The key is to try to find what are those core issues and make sure we're not erring on one side or the other. I think that's the best that we can do. And people fall all sides of this. Great question. Thanks for waiting, Brian. Here is one I want to ask you, Jonathan, get your take on this one. This is from Godless Engineer. Says, I feel like what y'all are saying, I'm guessing this person might be from the South, just throwing it out there. I feel like what y'all are saying is that if someone isn't convinced by your arguments, then they just don't understand. Is that accurate? So someone doesn't believe because they just don't understand. If they understood more, they would believe.
So obviously, I think that if someone is fully informed and being completely rational, then they will, in the long run at least, find Christianity to be true and well supported. That's just a necessary consequence of my belief that Christianity is true and supported by evidence. Um, so, um, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fair. That's a pretty straightforward, quick response to this. That's fair in one sense. We all hold beliefs that we think are true, or we wouldn't hold them. That's true politically. That's true historically. That's true when it comes to religion. Now, of course, the Christian worldview says that it's not just an intellectual movement to become a Christian. It's also a part of the heart and the will. It's a whole commitment, and all of that can get in the way according to what Scripture says. But fair enough. Okay, let's keep going here. If you have questions for Dr. Mcclatchy, we're talking about deconstruction, deconversion, how we should face doubts. Make sure you put question in caps, and I'll come to it. Let me jump back here. There's some specific questions. We're not so much taking questions about theology and apologetics today. It's more so about how we face doubt, about deconstruction, etc. So tell me some of the common questions that you are hearing from people. Are there threads that tie them together, or people just all over the map when they come in with doubts?
Yeah, it is rather all over the map, but there are certain things which are probably more common than others. Divine hiddenness is probably the most common. And related to that, of course, is the problem of evil, which is also a very, very common question that people bring up. And I think, by the way, that as a Christian, is perfectly okay to say, to concede that there is some evidence that tends to disconfirm Christianity. In fact, I tell people that if you that you should be very careful or very wary of people who tell you that all of the evidence supports their view, right? Because for any complex topic, whether we're talking about Christianity or evolution or climate change or whatever it happens to be, there's going to be evidence both for and against the issue at hand. And so when it comes to something like the problem of evil, I do consider that to constitute some evidence that tends to disconfirm theism, namely that if it was the only evidence on the table, then I would obviously be an atheist. I just don't think it is the only evidence on the table, and I think that a lot of people tend to over estimate the potency or strength of the problem of evil, because a lot of people are impressed with the sheer number of instances that we have of apparently gratuitous suffering in the world. And one thing that often gets missed is that these instances are not epistemically independent, right? They're epistemically dependent. If God has a morally sufficient justification for permitting one instance of evil, either natural or personal evil in the world, then he may well have a similar moral sufficient justification for permitting a second one, a third one, and so forth. And so it's not clear that the second instance of evil in the world carries the same evidential force as the first, and so forth. And so you have this problem of diminishing returns by multiplying examples. Whereas by contrast with the case of Christianity, we not only have evidence that is extensive, but is also varied in kind. We have numerous categories of evidence that span multiple disciplines. And so when you take these two competing cumulative cases, I'm more inclined to favor the cumulative case that has more varied kinds of evidence. And when a certain evidential threshold is reached in support of theism and Christianity more particularly, it provides an indirect basis for thinking that there is some morally sufficient justification for the evil and apparent injustices that we see in this world, even if it currently eludes us. So that's kind of my approach on the problem of evil, which is probably the most popular question that comes in.
Well, that fits my experience too. As you know, Jonathan, I teach the class, Why Does God Allow Evil, in our master's program. And one of the very first points that I make is the problem of evil is everywhere. So take debates about the environment. Are we destroying the environment? Are we ruining things? Discussions about race are about justice and injustice in ways that people have been hurt. LGBTQ conversation. Have we excluded people and dehumanized them and not loved them and cared for them? Gun control. Is it immoral to take somebody's guns? Does too much guns cause suffering and pain and hurt in society? All of this comes a problem of evil. I'm a big superhero guy. We kind of want to believe that we love superheroes, that there's somebody who can really get the bad guy and make things right that are unjust in the world. Now, I found when it comes to this, I'm curious on this part. I feel like if people come in with the assumption into my class that Sean's going to tell me why this bad thing happened, and that's their expectation, they're going to walk away disappointed. So I very quickly try to frame it for them and say, look, I can't answer why questions. A lot of things I don't know. We might not know this side of eternity. But the question is, which worldview offers the most cogent intellectually and existentially? When you reframe the question that way, I found that it changes the entire dynamic. So have you found that a lot of doubts are just driven by expectations people have about
Hmm.
answering prayer, about why there's evil and suffering, about how God would reveal himself? Is that a common thread that you see?
Yeah, it is common to have certain expectations of how God would work in the world if God exists. And because people observe that God doesn't work in the way that
Hmm.
is consistent with their expectations, that causes them to doubt. And I don't think that God is necessarily bound by our expectations of how God ought to work. Obviously, if Christianity is true, then it's not particularly unexpected that God might know certain things that we don't. And so I think that with the way that God works in the world, if we have reason to think that God exists and that He is just, that He is good, then we have a reason to trust that God has reasons for working in the way working in the world in the way that He does. A very common question that comes up is relating to the problem of divine hiddenness, the problem of unanswered prayer, and or the problem of people not having kind of an immediate
Right.
experience of God. And there's this slogan that you're familiar with, which is that Christianity is not a religion; it's a relationship. And I find that slogan to be unhelpful because
Hmm.
the sense in which we have a relationship with God, I think, is different from the sense in which friends have a relationship, or that you and I are able to converse with one another. And so I think that creates this false expectation.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I do encourage people to do is to be careful not to limit the scope of one's inquiry to one's own personal experience, because we find in Scripture that
Good.
God works in different ways in different people's experience. You find, if you read the Psalms, you find the problem of divine hiddenness is there throughout. Psalm 22, even, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from the words of my groaning, I call by day, and but you do not answer by night, and find no rest. And yet you also find in various parts of the Bible, God coming through in very providential and miraculous ways. You see that in the Exodus account, for example, or God's deliverance of the Jews from Babylonian exile, or the coming of Jesus, and so forth, and miraculous healings. So God works in different ways in different people's experience, and so it shouldn't be too surprising if the same thing happens in our own period. And as you're aware, there are books that have been written by the likes of Craig Keener, um, and other scholars. Lee Strobel has a book called The Case for Miracles on the same topic, which are looking at modern
Yeah.
contemporary miracle claims, some of which are, not all of them are, I think, robust, but there's enough of them that are quite credible, that I think that there's something to that. There are miracle claims which have independent attestation, some with medical experts giving testimony, and
Yep.
some with medical documentation.
JP Moreland has a book on that as well. So there's been a lot of talk about it.
Right.
Let's go
So
to
if,
uh, Kevin O'Connor, who joins in conversations now and then, has a great question I want to ask. By the way, if you're new, if this is helpful, just give us a little thumbs up. It helps in the matrix to get the word out there. Kevin O'Connor says, "Why do we even draw a deconstruct deconvert distinction? Why not just agree that we should follow the evidence and see where that leads, regardless of how orthodox our conclusions are?"
So I completely agree with the premise of the question. I'm a strong advocate of what's called scout mindset, which is from a book by
Julia.
epistemologist called Julia Galef. Yes, excellent book. I wrote a book review actually on my website, which
Mm.
is johnmcclatchy.com. You can
And by
search for
the way,
the book
before
review.
you go any further, I've reached out to Julia twice, invited her on my show, didn't hear back. Maybe she didn't get it. Maybe she's too busy. I think she describes herself as an atheist. And I said, I think we have
Yeah.
a lot in common. Would love to have a civil conversation. So if somebody forwards this to Julia, she happens to see it, I would love to have a conversation with you, find some areas of common ground, maybe some differences, and explore what you're going to talk about called the Scout Mindset. It's a fascinating book.
Yeah, absolutely. I've actually reached out to her myself, but also didn't hear back from her. So,
Okay.
but yeah, Julia Galef is an excellent thinker. She is an atheist, but I think that we have a lot to learn from her book, The Scout Mindset. Basically, she distinguishes between two sorts of mindset. There's soldier mindset, and there is scout mindset. Soldier mindset is out to defend his territory, or defend his team, if you will. You can think of it like a criminal defense attorney, where um, you're where the belief is the client, and you're just out there trying to defend that client, come what may. Whereas the scout mindset is out. The scout is out to try to find out he's out to discern, discover how the world really is,
Yep.
and he wants to uncover, or he wants to acquire a better map of reality, and uh, and I think there's a certain level of scout and a certain level of soldier in all of us, and what we want to do is try to maximize our scout mindset and minimize our soldier mindset. So yeah, I think that I encourage people to investigate both sides of the issue. I make it a habit to read more atheist literature than Christian literature because I want to try and to correct for my confirmation bias. Um, I tried to listen to more atheists on YouTube than I listened to Christians on YouTube, because I tried to correct for that confirmation bias. So I completely agree that we should try to objectively come to a conclusion about whether Christianity is true or not, and look at all of the voices that are making a case out there. I just happen to think that when you do that, the case supports Christianity.
Hence, that's why you are a Christian, uh,
Right.
which is fair, and you've been clear about that, and you've laid it out there. Let's go to this question. Just popped up. Good timing. If you have a question, we have time for a few more. Just put question in caps. And we're talking about doubt, deconversion, deconstruction is kind of the focus today. Oh, some were loaded. I lost it. Let me pull back here. Okay, here it is. MTMN Show says, is it okay to doubt and switch to another version of Christianity? Or is Protestant evangelicalism the only right denomination?
So I think it's absolutely okay to doubt and switch denominations. I personally find Protestant evangelicalism to be the denominational perspective that most reflects what I understand to be the teaching of Scripture. But yeah, I absolutely encourage people to not take things for granted. There's a proverb in Proverbs 14, verse 15 that says, "A simple man believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps." And I think that is very true. So yeah, I would encourage critical reflection on all beliefs that we hold.
That's a great response. Now, technically, when we say Protestant evangelicalism, it's not really a denomination. You would think of
Sure.
within Protestant evangelicalism would be like Calvary Chapel, Southern Baptist,
Right.
EV Free. So there could be within Protestant evangelicalism. For me, as a Christian, I'm less concerned that somebody identifies as an evangelical, especially because of some of the larger just cultural misunderstanding about what that term even means, and some could
That's
argue
true.
baggage, but what we do with the person of Jesus on the essentials. So the secondary issues about church practice, age of the earth, they're not unimportant, but I'm far less concerned if someone goes to a different denomination, another branch of Orthodox Christianity. That's just a different conversation than somebody says, I'm not sure I think Christianity is even true. So I will just approach that person with just as much sensitivity and awareness of the questions they're asking and try to address them accordingly. And let me make it clear, like one of the things I do in conversation is I've had people say I'm losing my faith. And I'll say things like, just so you know, I love you no matter what. My care for you doesn't change whether you switch denominations, whether you become a progressive Christian, whether you become an atheist. Like, I will not stop loving somebody, my family included, just because they hold different beliefs. But because I'm a Christian, I want Christians and non Christians to see that Christianity is true. I think it'd be dishonest if I didn't approach it that way.
Sure, completely agree.
Let's see. Any other questions left here? I see a ton of comments, which is great. Boom, boom, boom. So you made a distinction earlier. If you have a last question, maybe I have time for one or two more. Just put it in caps because there's a lot of great comments. What distinction do you make between questioning and between doubting? Because I think you said you wouldn't encourage somebody to doubt their faith, but you'd encourage someone to question their faith.
Yeah, I think it's healthy to ask questions, especially about why we believe what we believe. I distinguished earlier between questions and objections, right? We all have questions about all manner of things. How can Christ be both God and man at the same sense? How does it work to have two natures, for example? It's a very good question. Or what about the Amazonian tribesman that's never heard the gospel? Another great question. And we don't necessarily have complete and satisfactory answers to those questions. But a question isn't the same thing as having an objection. And as I said, I don't think there's anything wrong per se in doubting your faith. I think it's only wrong when it's done in an undisciplined manner, especially when people are only listening to the critical, skeptical side and are not listening to the positive case. And then it's just a downward spiral, which I think is an unhealthy approach. It's better to have a balanced diet where you're listening to thoughtful perspectives on both sides and trying to come to an honest conclusion, and trying to do so as objectively as you can.
That's good. And remember that oftentimes not just intellectual, like we said earlier. I encourage people to be honest with themselves. Do you want this to be true? Would you continue to believe it, even, if for whatever reason, get to the heart issue, the moral issue, the volitional issue? Um, Whoa, a bunch are flying by here. Let's see. Let's see here. Let's jump on this one. I might have to reword a little bit. This is a thoughtful question, and maybe we have time for this and one more. Our Boaz, thanks for your question, says, do we raise children who decide to deconstruct because we major in the minors as mentors? So we didn't directly address this, but you've talked about secondary and essential issues. And I think really quickly, I want you to jump in here. I think that's often true. We often major on the age of the earth. And a person thinks, oh, I'm not sure I'm convinced the earth is young anymore, abandons their entire faith. So I think we do this in a lot of ways, and it can be damaging to our kids if we approach it this way. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree. I like what how Bobby Conway puts it, which is, he says, I prefer to be as liberal as possible about my conservatism without lapsing into heresy. And
That's
I think, sorry?
go ahead, keep going.
I think that with the minors, we should be loose-handed. We should hold those with a loose grip. And with the majors, we should hold on to them, in correlation, in correspondence to the evidence. So, or in proportion to the evidence. So yeah, I think even something like inerrancy, a lot of churches will say basically, or insinuate that if there's a single error in the Bible, then the whole edifice collapses. And I think that's also a very unhealthy approach. As I said, I do think that all errors are epistemically equivalent. I think that reliability is the high stakes issue. I don't think inerrancy is a high stakes issue.
And I would add, I don't think it's necessarily just making minor things into major. It's the means by which we do it. Like we tell people, only idiots view scripture or the age of the earth or whatever the issue is. I don't want to pick on somebody in particular. Like we just state that the evidence is so solid and obvious. And then people meet really smart Christians, non-Christians who see the world differently. And that emotionally can make us question, go, what else have I been told is really obviously true that there might be other smart views to as well. So you said you want to expose your kids to the toughest objections. I actually want to expose my kids to people who are likable, to people who see the world differently, not only intellectually, but relationally. And so, as you know, we've taken trips to Berkeley and Salt Lake City and to meet Muslims and just bringing people who see the world differently, who are nice, kind, gracious people. So it doesn't shock my kids when they discover just, they haven't been given a straw man, so to speak. So I found that a helpful approach as well. Two more questions, if that's okay, and then we'll call it.
For sure.
Two great questions that came in. I'm curious what you would say about this one. Oops, let me pull this back here. Ecamm went crazy on me. Okay, here we go. Question from Heaven Bound. What kind of doubt is a sin? So when does doubt become sinful, if at all?
Yeah, so I think that doubting God's character, if we accept the premise that God exists and that He's revealed Himself in the Bible, I think doubting God's character, that He really is good, is sinful. And also, I think doubting Christianity in an undisciplined way rather than a disciplined way, where you're actually going and pursuing answers and you're trying to find out what the different perspectives are. That's a very healthy way of pursuing doubt. But if you're just spiraling into a nosedive, then that I would argue is wrong.
Okay, good. All right, fair enough. All right, Pine Creek, it's your lucky day, buddy. Two questions from you, because they're good questions. We'll wrap up with this one. Jonathan, what do you think? He says, would Jonathan be okay with doubting Christians talking to atheists about their doubts?
Yeah, I encourage Christians to talk to both sides. So my ministry, talkaboutdoubts.com, is a Christian ministry. So if you reach out to us, you're talking to a Christian. There are also atheist organizations that do the same thing. I think the Recovering from Religion Foundation is an atheist equivalent organization that's doing some very similar work on the other side to what we're doing at talkaboutdoubts.com. So yeah, I encourage people absolutely to read and listen to and engage with scholars and experts and thoughtful people on both sides of the issue.
I think that's great, and I suspected you were going to give that answer. I've seen you model that on your show, seen you model that in person, and I think that's commendable, the way Christians should approach. Hey, give us a final plug for talkaboutdoubts.com, because I probably send you 3 or 4 a week. I mean, maybe more. I don't know. When people send in wanting to talk with me, I just can't field all the questions. And I send it to you knowing you're going to treat people respectfully, graciously, give them resources, try to answer their emotional and intellectual questions. So I'm super pleased that it's a resource out there and want to help as I can. But just give a final plug for talkaboutdoubts.com so people can share it and go there also if it's helpful.
Sure, absolutely. So the website is talkaboutdoubts.com, and it's a ministry that seeks to give Christians who are struggling with intellectual doubts concerning the faith, as well as ex-Christians who want to explore whether their loss of faith is rational or whether there's a way back to faith, to contact us and be put in connection with, in contact with an expert or scholar in a relevant subject pertaining to their questions of concern and doubt. So some of the scholars that we have in our team are some of the world's leading experts. We have Dr. Luke Barnes, for example, who's a leading astrophysicist, widely considered one of the leading experts on the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. We've got Dr. Timothy McGrew on our team, who often takes questions, especially on the New Testament and epistemology. We've got Dr. Stephen Meyer of the Discovery Institute as well. So yeah, we have scholars in various fields. Dr. Titus Kennedy, as well as an archaeologist from Biola University, takes some questions occasionally. So yeah, if any of you are struggling in the audience with doubts about your faith, or want to explore whether your loss of faith was rational and whether there might be a way back to faith, please feel free to reach out to us at talkaboutdoubts.com, and we will endeavor to put you in contact with a scholar who can answer your questions.
Well, thanks for doing this, ministry. You're very generous with your time. And when I send you connections through my site, I always feel bad I can't do it myself. And you just eagerly are like, let's set up a Zoom. I want to help. It's just a wonderful ministry and approach that you're taking here. Means a ton. So go to talkaboutdoubts.com, or if you know somebody who's dealing with doubt, send them there, and it's a trusted resource. Make sure you hit subscribe. Here's a couple interviews coming up that I think you'll find fascinating. One is I reached out recently to a very influential lesbian YouTuber. She is not a Christian, describes herself as spiritual, and we just have a conversation. Some political issues come up. I probe what she thinks. We talk about her views about Jesus, which are very interesting, and whether or not Christians and gay people can be friends. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at the conversation. And then second, an agnostic who wrote one of my favorite books in the past 5 years about our storytelling nature. He believes that evolution offers a better explanation. I think our storytelling nature points to the fact that we're a part of a bigger story. But we have a civil, fun, thoughtful conversation you won't want to miss, so make sure you hit subscribe. If you ever thought about getting formal apologetics training, you know, Jonathan, we have a fully online degree. We actually get a lot of people who are experiencing doubt and are like, I want to formally study the resurrection, the problem of evil, and actually come to us in our program at Biola to try to make sense of this. So there's information below, but if you just have an undergrad degree and have thought you want to get a master's, the quick speed or the slow speed, join us. It would be great to have you. Jonathan, hang afterwards so I can say goodbye, but to the rest of you, got an interview coming up Friday you will not want to miss. One of the videos I'm most excited about. Have a great afternoon.